For over 75 years now, humanity has lived with a weapon that's capable of ending civilization as we know it. It's a total paradox, right? A weapon we built specifically so we'd never have to use it. A kind of peace that's kept only by the threat of total annihilation. But how stable is that peace, really? Let's take a closer look. That is a chilling admission from a man who was right at the center of the storm. And what he's talking about is this one moment when the entire world just held its breath, when the hands of the doomsday clock were creeping perilously close to midnight. It was a moment that reveals everything about the promise and the peril of nuclear weapons. So our story starts in October of 1962, during these 13 days that would go down in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And look, this wasn't some theoretical exercise. This was the closest the Cold War superpowers ever came to a full-blown nuclear war. As you can see on this timeline, things escalated with absolutely terrifying speed. On October 16th, American spy planes confirmed the unthinkable. The Soviets are putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Less than a week later, President Kennedy goes on TV and announces a naval quarantine around the island. And by the 24th, U.S. forces go to DEFCON 3. That is an alert status just 2 steps away from all-out nuclear war. The tension is just unbearable. And, as we'll see, on the 27th, the whole thing almost snaps. And this is what was at stake. Now, yeah, the U.S. had a clear advantage in long-range missiles, but let's be totally clear, having an advantage here is almost meaningless. Both sides had more than enough firepower to completely, utterly devastate the other and take the rest of the world down with them. The numbers you're looking at represent city-ending, world-altering power. So here's where this huge global standoff gets boiled down to one single isolated submarine. Deep in the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy is dropping these small, non-lethal practice depth charges. They're just trying to signal a Soviet sub, the B-59, to surface. But down in that submarine, they're totally cut off from Moscow. They have no idea these are just signals. The captain, who's exhausted and under just immense pressure, he thinks World War III has started, and he wants to launch their nuclear torpedo. Now, to launch that torpedo, it required the consent of 3 senior officers. 2 of them agreed, the captain and the political officer. They both said yes, but the third guy, Vasily Arkhipov, he refused. He's the one who calmed the captain down, argued against the launch, and convinced them to surface instead. In the middle of all that chaos, one man's refusal to panic stopped a single torpedo from launching that could have triggered an unimaginable catastrophe. It's a perfect illustration of the razor's edge we were all living on. The fact that we survived the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just luck, though. It was also because of this terrifying logic that had taken over Cold War strategy. And that logic is known as the doctrine of deterrence. The idea is actually pretty simple, almost primal. It's, you don't attack me because you know I can and I will hit you back so hard that you'll have nothing left to celebrate. It's a security that's based not on defense but on the absolute promise of mutual obliteration. So this whole doctrine rests on 3 key pillars. First, you need a credible threat, the weapons themselves. Second, you need credibility. Your enemy has to truly believe you'll actually use them if you're pushed. But that third pillar, that's the shakiest one, rationality. The entire system just assumes your enemy is a logical actor who will always choose survival over destruction. This logic leads to one of the most perfectly fitting acronyms in all of history, MAD, for mutually assured destruction. I mean, the paradox here is that for decades, the world's safety has been staked on a strategy whose very name admits that it's completely insane. Peace through the threat of Armageddon. But that third pillar of deterrence, rationality, well, that's where the whole theory starts to get really shaky. The entire system is built on this belief that in a crisis, leaders will act like cold, calculating machines. But is that how humans actually work? See, deterrence theory is built on this very specific idea of utilitarian rationality. It's the assumption that a leader, when they're faced with total annihilation, will always logically choose survival. It's a nice, clean model that works perfectly on paper. The problem is, crises don't happen on paper. I mean, just think back to Vasily Arkhipov in that submarine. His captain was ready to launch. He was being driven by fear and by bad information. He wasn't acting with that cool utilitarian rationality. He was acting under extreme stress. And that right there is the core vulnerability of the entire system. You know, psychologists like Daniel Kahneman have shown that our brains basically have two gears. System 2 is our slow, deliberate, rational mind. But in a high-stress crisis, when you have incomplete information and zero time to think, our fast, intuitive, and emotional System 1 just takes over. It's a survival mechanism, sure, but it's also really prone to bias and miscalculation, the two exact things nuclear strategy cannot afford. And this fundamental flaw in our thinking is now being stressed by a whole bunch of new challenges. It's not a two-player game anymore. We have 9 nuclear states now, which just increases the chances of a conflict. And new technologies like cyber weapons and AI can sow confusion, blurring the line between a conventional attack and a nuclear one, and shrinking the time leaders have to make a rational choice. So what we have is a precarious theory of security that's based on a flawed assumption about human nature and is now facing all these unprecedented new challenges. And oh yeah, maintaining this gamble comes at a staggering cost. Get this, in 2024 alone, the 9 nuclear-armed states spent a combined total of over $100 billion on their nuclear arsenals. That's more than a 30% increase in just the last 5 years. And as this chart makes really clear, that spending is not evenly distributed, not even close. The United States spent nearly $57 billion. That is more than all the other nuclear states combined. It's over 4 times what China, the second biggest spender, paid out. Let's try to break that down because the numbers are just so big. $100 billion a year works out to more than $190,000 every single minute of every single day spent on weapons that can never be used without triggering the end of the world. So when you put it all together, the near misses, the flawed logic, the insane costs, and the new complexities, you have to step back and ask a really fundamental question about this entire nuclear age we've been living in. Was this whole thing a brilliant, if absolutely terrifying, strategic success? Did this balance of terror actually keep the peace between the great powers for 3/4 of a century? I mean, that's the standard argument, and it's a pretty powerful one. But what if it wasn't strategy? What if it was just luck? What if we've just been rolling the dice for 75 years, and the worst number just hasn't come up yet? How many close calls, like the one with Vasily Arkhipov's submarine, have we actually survived by sheer dumb chance? This is the really uncomfortable truth that experts themselves are grappling with. As one report put it, it's hard for the people in charge to admit that our survival might depend less on brilliant strategy and more on the role of a cosmic die. But ignoring the role luck plays, well, that can lead to a really dangerous overconfidence in the whole system. And that leaves us with the final critical question. We live in a world that is more complex, with more nuclear players, more disruptive tech, and the exact same flawed, System 1-driven human psychology at the controls. How long can a gamble like that possibly last?